Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to Sabina Bremner. She will be talking on Marx, on intuitional materialism and the myth of the given. Let me just very briefly introduce her. She is currently a Humboldt Fellow here in Berlin, and if she's not a Humboldt Fellow, she's an assistant professor in Pennsylvania. She did a PhD at the Columbia University in 2021, and her focus is on Kant, value theory, 19th and 20th, European philosophy, and she has additional interests in the philosophy of race and gender, social and political philosophy, aesthetics, and early analytical philosophy as well. She wrote many papers. Her most recent papers are on the reflective judgment in Kant, and she also wrote a paper on Simone de Beauvoir's genealogy of morality. And other works are devoted to the revisability of the a priori and the question to which extent the a priori can be understood as ideology or ideology as a priori. The floor is yours. We are very much looking forward to your talk.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Very happy to be here. Okay, so everyone should have a handout. So please, I'm going to be reading my paper, but you can follow along with me on the handout. Okay. So Karl Marx's thesis on Feuerbach. So this is on Marx on intuitional materialism and the myth of the given. Karl Marx's theses on Feuerbach have long been taken as a schematic program for materialist theory, concluding with a notorious final thesis: the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Yet the meaning of these 11 deceptively transparent theses, as Louis Althusser claims, despite being only a few sentences long, has long been less than clear. Given the theses' mysterious nature, one of the primary meanings that has been associated with them has been an attack on mechanical materialism. Against a deterministic or fatalistic, mechanical construal of materialism, which would reduce human behavior to the material determinants of their behavior, Marx's main point in the theses is taken to exhort his reader towards activity, where activity is associated with material, concrete practice in the world. But it's interesting that in the theses, Marx actually never uses the term mechanical materialism, mechanisches Materialismus. The term can only be found employed by Friedrich Engels in a text published after Marx's death, in Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, more than 40 years after the composition of the theses. There, Engels rejects mechanical materialism as treating human subjects as mere objects of scientific investigation, affected only from without, rather than as potentially changeable and free beings. Instead, in the theses, Marx uses another phrase to disparage the brand of materialism that he rejects, once again attributed to Feuerbach. He refers to anschauendes Materialismus, and this in English has been translated as contemplative materialism. And I think that this translation has been unfortunate, so I'm going to sort of focus on this issue and what follows. Because I suggest that what Marx is rejecting is instead an intuitional or intuitive materialism. A materialism that acknowledges only passive affection by sense objects, rather than recognizing that sensing constitutes an activity. So that's quoting from the first thesis, and you have that on your handout. So I think that something has been missed in the course of translation. And so I want to sort of also think about sort of Marx rejecting an intuitional materialism in conversation with Kant on intuition and sensibility. So in my talk today, I'm going to take seriously the early Marx's attack on intuitional materialism rather than mechanical materialism, and investigate the force a conception of sensibility as activity has for his conception of materialism. Doing so, I suggest, entails interesting and important implications for Marx's philosophy of mind, a topic which has been neglected. So what I claim here is that it allows for a reading of Marx's materialism as a continuation or extension of certain formulations of idealism. And this has been explored in terms of Hegelian idealism, but here I'm really going to focus on kind of Marx as kind of taking up and also critiquing Kantian transcendental idealism. So in doing so, my reading can help to shed light on a problem for contemporary materialism articulated by Stuart Hall, which you have on your handout. So the materialism of Marxism cannot rest on the claim that it abolishes the mental character, let alone the real effects of mental events, i.e. thought. Yet Marx's framing of materialism as deriving its force from sensibility as an active faculty, rather than, as it is generally conceived, a merely passive receptivity, does not leave contemporary understandings of idealism unchanged either. A prominent strand of interpretation has read the post-Kantian tradition as united in rejecting the myth of the given, or the view of the cognizing mind as affected immediately by sense impressions, independent of the conceptual operations of the understanding. I claim that construing the rejection of the myth of the given in this manner corresponds to the idealism that Marx criticizes in the Theses, because it identifies cognitive activity as the sole purview of understanding on the one hand, and attributes cognitive passivity solely to sensibility or empirical receptivity on the other. Instead, I take Marx to associate materialism with a rejection of this dichotomy between the apparently higher and lower faculties. And I claim that he, like Kant, points to reflection on organic life as a potential way out of this dichotomy. So I think this interpretation leads us back to Engel's later critique of mechanical materialism, but kind of takes a different route than the way many of Marx's interpreters would have it. Okay, so that's the introduction. I'm going to move into section 2 now. So in the context of the Theses, Marx associates intuitional materialism, Anschauung des Materialismus, with a failure to notice what he calls sensory or sensible human activity, or sensibility as a practical activity. And this claim has been translated as sensuous human activity and sensuousness as a practical activity. And as a result of this, the loss of the connection to intuition, Anschauung, on the one hand, and to sensibility, Sinnlichkeit, on the other, has been lost. And I think also an important connection in the history of philosophy. And so I take kind of the sense of sensuousness as activity to correspond to only one of the senses that Marx attributes to Sinnlichkeit. And I think that the first sense, the primary sense, can be captured only by referring to sensibility. Okay, so to bring this out requires us to also look at Kant on this issue. So on Kant's conception of sensibility, intuition takes place only insofar as the object is given to us, but this in turn is possible only if it affects the mind in a certain way, right? So this is Kant in the first critique. The capacity or receptivity to acquire representations through the way in which we are affected by objects is called sensibility. Sensibility then just is our receptivity to objects of intuition, our mind's capacity to be affected by things outside us. Through sensibility, objects are given to us. Indeed, there is no other way in which objects can be given to us. Yet objects are thought through the understanding from which arise concepts. The sensible content of our cognitive representations, the sense impressions of objects, insofar as they affect sensibility, Kant terms matter. Matter as the apparently direct or brute impingement of sense impressions or sense data on a receptive faculty. Also, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, okay. Is distinguished from the form of the appearance as what allows the manifold to be intuited as ordered in certain relations, the latter of which Kant will later attribute to space and time. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this issue in Kant. Marx begins the theses by taking up and revising certain aspects of this Kantian model of sensibility and intuition. So in thesis 1, he claims that the chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the thing, reality, sensibility, is conceived only in the form of the object or of intuition, but not as sensory human activity. practice, not on the side of the subject. In this passage, Marx rejects a materialism on which sensibility is understood as an inert object, a merely receptive organ, as Lukács would later write, and where the object of intuition, the sensed object, the empirical datum, is taken to stand apart from the human subject, as if it can be considered independently of the sensibility's contribution in presenting it in consciousness. Instead, Marx claims the sensed object is bound up with the activity of sensing, which in turn constitutes a practice. Indeed, Marx continues, in contradistinction to materialism in the vein of Feuerbach, this active side was developed abstractly by idealism, which of course does not know real sensing activity as such. What materialism is missing, in other words, is a crucial insight from idealism, that experience is not given, but must be mediated by the activity of cognition in order to be intelligible at all. In Kant's conception of transcendental idealism, what does the work of this mediation, of the contribution of cognition into experience, is, on many interpretations, not sensibility, but understanding. Thus, Kant claims in the Transcendental Analytic of the first critique, the same function that gives unity to the different representations in a judgment also gives unity to the mere synthesis of different representations in an intuition, which, expressed generally, is called the pure concept of understanding. It is the understanding through its categories which ultimately synthesizes concepts into judgments, as well as intuitions into unified representations. In the Transcendental Deduction, Kant seems to reiterate the idea that synthesis or combination, and with it all cognitive form or unity, is the sole purview of the understanding. So Kant says that all combination, whether we are conscious of it or not, whether it is a combination of the manifold of intuition or of several concepts, is an action of the understanding, since the combination of a manifold in general can never come to us through the senses. Insofar as sensibility is just another term for receptivity, its function restricted only to being affected by objects, Kant seems to give sensibility the sense of a certain passivity of cognition in comparison with the understanding. Right, so you could think that Kant is saying that sensibility is passive and understanding is active. So I'm going to come back to this issue, but this presents considerable conundrums for Kant's conception of self-consciousness, which is divided between its empirical and intellectual aspects. So since our intuition is not, quote, mere self-activity, i.e. intellectual, and sensibility refers only to the manner in which perceptions are given in the mind without spontaneity, we can know ourselves as subjects only as appearance, as empirical things. So while we are also aware of ourselves to be spontaneous, active, thinking subjects, such awareness, for risk of falling into paralogism, can never amount to knowledge. The passivity of sensibility thus presents the challenge, one which German idealists would later take up and also reject, at least Kant's own approach to this, the challenge of reconciling these divided aspects of our self-cognition. But on the other hand, sensibility is also a Vermögen, which has a sense not only of cognitive faculty, but also capacity or capability, activity, one which also has its own forms, namely space and time, by which it too makes a structuring contribution to the presentation of experience. Thus, Kant leaves significant ambiguity as to the extent to which sensibility can be understood as active alongside understanding, and thereby, ultimately, not strictly passive after all. So we can take Marx to exploit this ambiguity by radically extending Kant's line of thought. Rather than attributing activity primarily to the function of understanding, Marx attributes activity all the way down, even to the apparently brute affection of the subject by sense objects. It is in the failure to recognize that the activity of cognition extends down to the apparently mute reception of the manifold of intuition that the idealist, quote, does not know real sensing activity as such. Thus, Marx claims that experience is not to be conceived in terms of passive copying of empirical givens, but as the product of the active work of mediation. Recent discussions in the scholarship parse Kant's ambiguity on this point in terms of his position on non-conceptual content, or the extent to which sensibility makes its own independent contribution to cognition, an abstraction from conceptual unification or the activity of understanding. On one prominent line, Kant's conception of the mediation of cognition has been understood in terms of conceptual mediation or rational spontaneity, so strictly in terms of conceptual mediation or rational spontaneity. The idea that, as Kukla puts it, the objects of perception cannot be mute sense data or raw particulars because we can see nothing if we've not developed a space of concepts that would let us make sense of what we see. So Kant's influence on the history of philosophy has been taken to consist in the rejection of the myth of the given, the idea that no intelligible distinction can be drawn between sense data given to conscious awareness and those cognitive processes by which this data is taken up and conceptualized. On such a view, the post-Kantian tradition is unified by the broad agreement that there is no given, and this because the particulars of perception are already conceptually mediated and propositionally structured. Governed by concepts as semantic rules, the perceptual features or sense impressions impinging on sensibility are thus never given, but already normative. But in claiming that the given is a myth, this picture reinstates yet another distinction, which Marx in the Theses explicitly rejects, namely the dichotomy between sensibility as passive and understanding as active. So as John McDowell puts it, experience is passive, but draws into operation capacities that genuinely belong to spontaneity. In other words, to the extent that there is any active contribution of sensibility at all, McDowell attributes this activity to understanding as spontaneity, such that sensibility remains strictly passive, and indeed has no isolable role at all. So here's a quote from John McDowell on this point. Experiences have their content by virtue of the fact that conceptual capacities are operative in them, and that means capacities that genuinely belong to the understanding. Indeed, McDowell argues that we can avoid falling into idealism and slighting the independence of reality only by recognizing the experiencing subject as passive, acted on by independent reality, only by retaining a distinction between passive sensibility and active understanding or spontaneity. And Marx's theses have been understood in a similar vein. So as Sebastian Rudel interprets them, the prior materialisms that Marx rejects conceive of, quote, material reality exclusively as an object of intuition or as to be known receptively. On the alternative Marx endorses, by contrast, true materialism reveals spontaneity and its knowledge to be of and thus to be a material reality. Thus, it conceives of material reality not merely as an object of intuition, but as spontaneity. Here, once more, the activity of sensibility is reduced to spontaneity, in particular, the materiality of, quote, first-person knowledge, which is non-receptive, non-empirical. So thus is the activity only of the higher faculties of understanding or reason rather than the lower faculty of sensing. Yet Marx does not emphasize the materiality of understanding. Instead, Marx expressly draws attention to a conception of sensibility as active. His primary critique of the idealists in the Theses is that they've developed the role of activity only abstractly, which is to say, at the level of discursivity, concepts or understanding, a level which is general and abstract insofar as it is at a remove from particular concrete intuitions and senses, and the senses. Marx claims further that what idealists have so far failed to acknowledge is not the materiality of self-knowledge, but, quote, sensing activity. Thus, rather than restricting cognitive activity to understanding or to reason, I read Marx as putting pressure on the very way in which this distinction is carved up, the identification of activity with understanding on the one hand, and passivity with sensibility or empirical affection on the other. Indeed, Marx claims that it is only insofar as an active, free role for sensibility is retained that human beings can exist in an unalienated relationship to the external world. So here's a quote, so it's at the end of your handout on page 2. So for the starving man, it is not the human form of food that exists, but only its abstract existence as food. It could just as well be there in its crudest form, and it would be impossible to say wherein this feeding activity differs from that of animals. That is, the alienated subject can notice food only on the discursive, not the sensible level, only as an abstraction. Thus, she can make no distinction between food in its crudest form and food in its human form, no distinction, that is, in the sensible particularity of its form at a level of discernment finer than that which can be carved up by concepts. For Marx, this capacity for sensible discernment shows up as an aesthetic capacity. So here's another quote. The care-burdened, poverty-stricken man has no sense for the finest play. The dealer in minerals sees only the commercial value, but not the beauty and the specific character of the mineral. He has no mineralogical sense. The alienated subject can only cognize concepts like commercial value and thus cannot discern distinctions among particular intuitions, like the beauty and the specific character of a given mineral or the finest play. Thus, the activity of sensibility, sense perception, manifests itself among alienated and unalienated subjects as a difference in strictly sensory capacity. So Marx writes, just as only music awakens in man the sense of music, and just as the most beautiful music has no sense for the unmusical ear, the senses of the social man differ from those of the non-social man. Marx specifies this by claiming that the richness of subjective human sensibility, a musical ear, an eye for beauty of form, in short, senses capable of human gratification, senses affirming themselves as essential powers of man, or the five senses, but also the so-called mental senses, the practical senses, will, love, etc. In a word, human sense, all call for cultivation as part and parcel of the cultivation of species being. Marx insists, in other words, on sensibility's independence from understanding, which he takes to be expressed by sensibility's active attunement to aesthetic richness as a capacity that is independent of determination by, or at least can be independent of determination by, abstract and generalized concepts. So if Marx is read as rejecting the passivity of sensing in the way that I've been urging, you might think that this commits him to a form of full-blown idealism, or as McDowell puts it, to the specter of frictionless spinning which deprives us of anything recognizable as empirical content. Instead, Marx takes the recognition of sensibility as an active power of the mind to entail a rejection of idealism, and that enables us to overcome the view that the thing, outer sense, is to be understood, quote, only as object or as appearance, instead acknowledging it as a product of practical human sensible activity, as praxis on the side of the subject. So the importance of real sensing activity is just the point that Marx claims idealists have missed. While they've grasped the role of activity abstractly, much as Sellers and his followers acknowledge the activity of the abstract conceptual capacities to be operative in sensibility, they've missed the role of genuinely concrete activity and have thereby collapsed sense objects into thought objects. In holding that the object of sense is not inertly given, but is shaped by the structuring activity of the mind, Marx understands this claim to be consistent, Pacha McDowell, with a rejection of idealism, consistent, in other words, with materialism. So Marx rejects the myth of the given, but he also rejects the usual strategy for overcoming the myth. That is, Marx rejects both empiricism, what he calls intuitional materialism, the view that knowledge is formed on the basis of sense content given to us without cognitive mediation, and idealism. So he rejects that form of empiricism, and he also rejects a certain form of idealism, the view that such cognitive activity is wholly reducible to the conceptual operations of understanding at work even in the receptivity of sensibility. So he rejects both this naively empiricist view, we could say, sort of an intuitional materialism, and a view of idealism that kind of associates activity solely with understanding and doesn't see anything for the sensibility to contribute on its own. So thus, Marx's response to the myth of the given comes by way of expanding the domain of cognitive mediation to more explicitly encompass sensibility. In doing so, Marx does not take his account of sensibility to amount to a frictionless spinning, but to be a way of acknowledging the objectivity of empirical content, a presupposition of materialism, not idealism. So how can this be the case? Okay, so to answer this question, we must examine the second sense that Marx posits of sensing activity. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels claim that Feuerbach, this is also in your handout, so I'm in section 3 now, does not see how the sensible world around him is not a thing given directly from all eternity, remaining ever the same, but the product of industry and of the state of society. And indeed, in the sense that it is a historical product, the result of the activity of a whole succession of generations, each standing on the shoulders of the preceding one, developing its industry and its commerce, modifying its social system according to the changed needs. So sensing activity admits of another meaning than the one I considered above, and this is the one that I think has been more discussed than the first one. Namely, experience, the objects of sense, are shaped by our collective practices as concrete, sensible activity in the material world. So for instance, the cherry tree, like almost all fruit trees, was, as is well known, only a few centuries ago transplanted by commerce into our zone, and therefore only by this action of a definite society in a definite age has it become sense certainty for Feuerbach. Thus, Marx suggests that the given is a myth not merely in that it is shaped by the activity of the conceptual operations of the mind, but also in that it is shaped by human practice over the course of history and culture. Where the cherry tree appears as brute object of intuition or mere empirical given, Marx and Engels claim that it can only take this form as the result of a long process of human intervention into the workings of nature. Even an apparently neutral, inert, and passively presented empirical datum, like a cherry tree, is already socially shaped by concrete human activity. What we take up in intuition is, in this now precisified sense, the product of sensible activity. Thus, the first meaning of sensory activity Marx recognizes picks out the activity of sensibility as faculty of sensing against a picture of the sensory apparatus as passive mere receptivity. So that's the sense that I've been discussing so far. The second refers to the activity of human beings in making objects of outer sense as the domain of material social practice. In both cases, the manifold of intuition is shaped by human activity, the first in consciousness, the second in embodied action. Where for Kant, the mediating work of sensibility consisted in the contribution of the spatio-temporal forms of intuition, for Marx, these structuring forms of experience are themselves empirically and historically constituted. So my emphasis in this paper is really on the early Marx, as you can probably tell so far, but as he elaborates, as Marx elaborates later in Capital, there's also an emphasis there on the distortions of time under capitalism, so circulation time, surplus labor time, time wages. Maybe you could say similar things about space as well. So in other words, both Kant and Marx agree that sensibility supplies its own forms, or its own form. Yet Marx claims that this form is made in experience and thus made in sensibility itself, rather than, as Kant holds, an a priori operation of cognition prior to experience. The empirical is thus not given, but made. Insofar as we make the empirical social world, our sensibility is to that extent an active faculty. And so I think this also allows Marx to recognize a capacity for free agency, which is distinct from moral agency. So Kant has a view of the faculty of choice in human beings as only free if determined by practical reason, thus by the higher faculties, and thus only if moral. But Kant also recognizes that the faculty of choice is always impure, because it is inevitably also influenced by sensibility, even when it is determined by practical reason. So I have a quote on your handout. I'm not sure that I'm going to read it now. But basically where Kant says that the human faculty of choice can be affected but not determined by sensible impulses. So on Kant's view, freedom and activity in the practical domain are expressed only through the spontaneity of reason, while sensibility remains passive, as what is merely affected by impulses. So that's for Kant, but for Marx, on the other hand, by insisting on an activity, on an account of sensibility as active, Marx allows for a more capacious picture of human agency, one on which freedom does not find its source in motivation by a supersensible, non-natural order of causality, but through one's sensitivity to the empirical order of nature. So I have another quote on this. Marx writes, for instance, that the sensible outburst of my life activity is passion, which thus becomes here the activity of my being. So passion, sort of, sensible impulses as active rather than passive. So I take Marx to call for the marriage of a crucial materialist insight with a crucial idealist insight. The materialist insight consists in the recognition of the importance of sensibility, of reality, as against thought or understanding, human beings not as disembodied minds, but as shaped by historical, social, empirical circumstances and engaged in concrete shared practices. The idealist insight acknowledges that that consciousness as such, and with it experience through the work of sensibility, is an activity. So these two conceptions of sensibility as activity and the activity of concrete embodied labor are not as distinct as they may initially seem. They're related by the notion of life, by which Marx and Engels generally qualify their conception of material processes. Although I've noticed that, often the reference to life will sort of get read out when it's taken up by other commentators. So for instance, in the German ideology, Marx and Engels claim that, quote, the existence of men is their actual life process. And they refer often not to the material determination of consciousness, but to life as what determines consciousness. So many of their references are thus not to determination by material processes, but to the real, material, physical, historical, or active life process, not to material production, but to the production of material life or to the material conditions of life, right? And so I think this reference to life is actually really important because, I think a lot changes if you see them not as referring to the material determination of consciousness, but to the material determination of a life process or material conditions of life. So indeed, they refer regularly to life as such, where life involves before everything else, eating and drinking, housing, clothing, and various other things. So while for Marx and Engels, quote, the mind is from the outset afflicted with the curse of being burdened with matter, they don't understand matter as brute or passive here. So they claim that it makes its appearance in the form of agitated layers of air, sounds, in short, of language. So here matter is conceived as embodied human activity, once again, in particular the activity of communicating one's inmost thoughts. So it is thus continuous with, not opposed to consciousness. And the means of production thus constitutes an organic process rather than a mechanical one. So in the 1844 manuscripts, Marx refers to labor as life activity and as productive life, yet material practice as life activity is cast in turn as continuous with consciousness. So Marx writes that man has conscious life activity. The material and the mental are therefore conceived as of a piece with one another rather than existing in opposition. So indeed, it is because it is the activity of consciousness which enables self-reflection on what one is doing that the material processes of laboring activity can count as free when unalienated. So Marx writes that conscious life activity directly distinguishes man from animal life activity because it is through consciousness that his own life can be an object for him and his activity free activity. Unestranged labor thus consists in free conscious activity in which the productive activity of labor is integrated into the activity of consciousness as mediated through the sensory reception of what one is empirically producing. So Marx diagnoses the opposition between materialism and idealism. So on the one hand, an objectified deterministic brute materialism, and on the other hand, an idealism that solipsistically takes current economic conditions to be a projection of one's own mind on the other. So both of these are a symptom of widespread alienation under capitalism. In conditions of alienation, labor no longer appears as one's own activity, but as external, not one's own, but someone else's. The product of labor thus appears only as an alien object, exercising power over one. So Marx writes that the more the worker exerts himself, the more powerful becomes the alien world of objects, which he creates over and against himself, the poorer he himself, his inner world, becomes. The external world no longer appears to be the product of human activity and thus is the potential target of change, but as an alien world of objects, while human subjects are not animated by rich inner worlds and free conscious activity, but determined mechanistically by brute causal forces. Counterintuitively, this distorted picture aligns not only with the viewpoint of crude materialism, but also that of naive idealism, insofar as the latter takes the inner realm of the mental to be unaffected by external empirical circumstances, thus appearing as an alien world of objects. So I have more here about how this figures into the critique of the young Hegelians. Where human beings' relations are taken to be chimeras, ideas, dogmas, under the yoke of which they are pining away. So human beings, Marx claims, are not objects or automata, as under brute materialism, but nor are they disembodied minds, as entailed by naive idealism. If Marx and Engels reject the apparent opposition between materialism and idealism, and with it the division between mind and matter, as a mere byproduct of capitalist alienation, they advocate a materialism in its place, which integrates the empirical and the ideal, the sensible and the conceptual, the mental and the material. Okay, so now I'm into section 4. So I have, in the full paper, I have kind of an extended discussion of life, kind of returning to this point about life, but looking at it in the context of when Engels finally does talk about mechanical materialism in 1886. And I can go into that in the Q&A if people are interested in it. But maybe I'll just read out sort of the kind of one of the most famous lines. So Engels writes that the materialism of the last century was predominantly mechanical, because at that time of all natural sciences, only mechanics, and indeed only the mechanics of solid bodies, the mechanics of gravity had come to any definite close. And so what the animal was to Descartes, man was to the materialists of the 18th century, a machine. This exclusive application of the standards of mechanics to processes of a chemical and organic nature, in which processes, the laws of mechanics are indeed also valid, but are pushed into the background by other higher laws, constitutes the first specific, but at that time, inevitable limitation of classical French materialism. So I'm sorry that I don't have that quote on the handout. But so kind of what I end up taking from this point is that you know, I see Engels as kind of pushing on this conception of a kind of a purely mechanical conception of science, and he's advocating a conception of biology which can allow for more sophisticated kinds of explanation than just mechanical explanation. And I put this together with kind of the much earlier writings on life and the life process. So there's more that I can say there, but yeah. So maybe I'll just read out this one point. So thus far from, so many have understood the advent of Darwinian natural selection as an extension of mechanical explanation to the realm of biological life, allowing for various naturalist, non-vitalist, or physically reductionist views of the unity of the sciences. Thus far from positing an irreducible level of teleological explanation, biological phenomena are taken to be continuous with mechanical cause and effect relations. To the contrary, Engels claims that science had to develop modes of explanation more sophisticated than the exclusive application of the standards of mechanics to processes of a chemical and organic nature in order to encompass biology and chemistry as full-blooded sciences, dovetailing with arguments to the effect that Darwinian natural science retains an irreducible role for non-mechanical, purposive, or functionalist explanation. And so I see Engels as sort of making this point, and I think it's important for considering kind of the conception of life that's at issue and why the concept of life is so important to them. Even while they're sort of insisting on a conception of materialism as a science, what's the concept of science that they have in view there? Okay, so I'm going to come back now to, so I take this also in conversation with what with Kant's writings on purposiveness and life. And in that context, in the third critique, Kant attributes constitutive principles a priori for feeling as part of his way of thinking about life and organisms. So he attributes these constitutive principles of feeling to the power of judgment, and therefore sort of calls on a conception of sensibility that is determinable independently of the conceptual operations of the understanding. Or his account of aesthetics really sort of calls on a conception of sensibility that is in some way independent of understanding. So we might extend Kant's point, in other words, by saying that the process of what Kant called finding the general for the particular, rather than merely subsuming the particular under the general whose concept is given, calls on the activity of sensibility, a faculty which in such cases can no longer be strictly subordinated to the understanding. And so I read this together with kind of a strand in Lukács as well. So Lukács noticed that the revolutionary attitude possesses a very real and concrete field of activity where it may be brought to fruition, namely art, as evidenced by the theoretical and practical role Kant in the Critique of Judgment assigned to the principle of art as mediator in perfecting his system. So it is by appeal to reflective judgment, which is at work both in thinking about purposiveness in nature and in aesthetics, but for Lukács here in its aesthetic expression, that Lukács situates his conception of praxis. So Lukács writes, if man is fully human only when he plays, the contents of life may be salvaged from the deadening effects of the mechanism of reification, but only insofar as these contents become aesthetic. So Marx famously makes a similar remark in the 1844 manuscripts. In Unalienated Labor, Marx writes that man forms things in accordance with the laws of beauty, thus drawing a connection between the two senses of sensible activity that I've outlined so far, the practical and the sensory perceptive. Both, for Marx, as I pointed out earlier, are importantly aesthetic as well as organic. So both are expressions of life. So in understanding truth as non-isolable from practice, we interrogate the given not only as conceptually mediated, but as collectively made, leading us in turn to reflect on the current constitution of material reality, and with it on the prospects for its alteration. So this leads me to my conclusion. We learn to see the whole world of sense as shaped by the activity of labor and creation, of production, just as much as our own perceptive faculty is. But we can only learn this mode of seeing if we extend the domain of a cognitive agency beyond the stretch of conceptual schemes to encompass that presentation of the manifold of intuition as more than mere conceptual content. Thank you.
I'm sure there are many questions. The Q&A is open.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask you something about some of the missing concepts in your talk, because as I would read Lukács, especially now, so how you reconstructed now this whole problem of the myth of the given and Marx's discussion of idealism versus materialism and so on and so forth. As I see that, there are like some, and for some reason you left them out, some central concepts of Marx missing in this picture, like production, exchange, and especially historicity. So let's, if we go for Lukács, like for Lukács, I think is the most important figure here, because he's already 1923 working through all these problems with neo-Kantianism and so on and so forth. So my question is, like, where do you would put the historical perspective and especially the social perspective in this problem, because the problem for Marx is not that whether there's a given or not, but how something is given, like how practice mediates social action, and that like Lukács puts it, his critique of neo-Kantianism is that the bourgeois philosophy takes a certain a priori as given and tries to eradicate the fact that this form of rationality is produced by a certain form of sociality, and that is to say by a certain order of exploitation, and so on. And so, yeah, so that would be basically my question, if you could elaborate more on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I should say that I think this is a great question, and I don't take this paper. So I think it's a key aspect of the view, and I think you're right that I don't address it fully in this particular paper, because the kind of the intervention of this paper I think is specific. It's about sort of the myth of the given and kind of thinking about Marx's view of consciousness, etc. But you're right. I think you're completely right that there's, you know, to the extent to which any of these views are sort of Kantian or neo-Kantian, there's this further critique of the material determination of the a priori, of the, you know, whatever cognition is doing on this picture. There's also this this aspect in which cognition itself is socially shaped and materially determined. And so I'm not focusing on that here because I think there's been more attention to it than what I'm focusing on in this particular paper. So I take myself to address it very briefly, but when I talk about the second sense of sensibility, you know, I think that to some extent gets into this issue of, you know, sensibility as a practice, sensibility as the way in which we're making the world, but also in a way that ultimately forms consciousness. So I think there's a, you know, kind of a looping or kind of a reciprocal relation here. But I'm, in the context of this paper, I'm really sort of engaging with views that I think have read Marx in what I take to be a kind of mechanical way. And I think if you kind of go too far down that line of like thinking that everything that we think is already sort of completely materially determined and shut down, then it's hard to make sense of the question of critique. And so I think that's one of the motivations for sort of stressing the role of activity in Marx's picture. Yeah, does that help somewhat? Yeah, but I have another paper where I'm a co-written paper on ideology, and we sort of get into this issue of the material. We kind of read ideologies on a priori, and then we kind of look at the material determination of the a priori. And so that I think might engage more fully with your question.
Thank you so much, Sabina. That was really beautiful. I think I'm pretty much just very sympathetic to almost everything you said. So I have two questions. One has to do with, so on the bottom of page 2 of the handout, you have this interesting diagnosis, or you have an interesting reading of Marx's diagnosis of alienation that I don't know if it's an objection, but it's at least a question, where you said, for Marx, the alienated subject can only cognize concepts. And then you have this passage where I guess this is odd result of the diagnosis of alienation is on the one hand being reduced to a form of abstract subjectivity, and then on the other hand being reduced to an animal. So this is sort of the passage you quote right below it, where this feeding activity, it's hard to say whether or not this feeding activity differs from that of animals. So there's just this sort of odd, maybe it's a feature of Marx's account, I'm not sure what you make of it, but this diagnosis of alienation is on the one hand being reduced to abstract concepts, but also being reduced to a very, you could say, brute form of animality. And then the second question might just be clarificatory. It's in this third section about life as solving the problem of these two senses of sensory activity. And I think this is just a question to ask you to say more exactly about how life solves that problem. So you say that sensory activity, the first sense is sensibility is an activity, so it's a faculty. And I guess, yeah, the question is just how does life help you get at that idea? And then you, in responding to this first question, you pointed to the importance of the second sense of sensory activity as being historical and about forms of social practice. But there again, I wasn't sure how life plays into, how does life bring together these two senses of sensory activity that you want to draw out?
Thanks so much for both questions. So for the first one, yeah, I think you're totally right that there's also this kind of dimension of the critique that I don't really address so much in this particular reading of kind of the reduction of human beings to animals. And I think, you know, maybe to put that point in conversation with what I do say about it, I think it's kind of interesting that, you know, the point is really about sort of the reduction to animality, you know, to sort of, which animality is often associated with kind of, you know, with the lower faculties, with kind of mere sensing, kind of acting solely on impulse, etc. And I think kind of that juxtaposition is kind of interesting in this context, that on the one hand, you have kind of the insistence on kind of this active role for sensibility, but on the other hand, you have this kind of dimension of the critique that kind of an active conception of sensibility is not just kind of thinking of the human being as animal in some way, but it is essential to being human. And so I think that I kind of read that point as kind of adding on, I guess, to this critique of the dichotomy between sort of the higher and the lower faculties that I see Marx as engaging with. But I think you're right that I don't fully take that up. And for your other question, so kind of more about how the question of life links the two senses of sensibility. So I'm not, yeah, I think perhaps this is not as developed as it should be. I guess I see it, so I read this in a, you know, I think I find Kant helpful for thinking about some of these things. So I guess I see the second sense of sensibility as practice. In that sense, I see Marx really emphasizing this conception of practice as a practice of life, as sort of a part of the life process, but kind of not a fixed conception of life, but a sort of dynamic, open conception of life, which, you know, for me, I sort of read together with kind of the insistence on the activity of sensibility. So I see this active dimension kind of in both senses. That I think the insistence on life rather than just material determination as such, but material life is what determines consciousness in some way, as important for sort of countering this view of Marx as being very deterministic. And so the connection, as I see it, I mean, I really see it in Marx himself, in the way in which he talks about both consciousness and labor as life activity. And so I'm not sure that I can say more than that. You know, really looking forward to discussing this with you further. But it seems like there's a very strong connection for them, and so that's kind of what I'm trying to bring out. But yeah, I agree that more should be said. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay, we are running short of time, so maybe we can try to keep things brief. I know it's very difficult, but
I'll try.
We have 5 more people on the list.
Yes, thank you so much. It's really a follow-up on Karen's question and the last point you were discussing. with respect to labor, it seems to me that it might be a key to the problem that you just mentioned, because when you introduced how activity is shaping our sensory or our sensibility, you introduced it by the charity, which was brought into Central Europe. And it always seemed to me that labor plays a more important role because it's our engagement with the world, forming the world, making it accessible to us. So when Marx was speaking about that, the whole history of sensibility is a history of industry, it seems to me to point to this very fact. It's not just that someone made an object and then we have a sensibility of this object, it's our engagement. So if we engage with a violin, I can't, but people who can, they develop a sensibility and a musicality for their ear, they have new sensibilities. And this seems to be the very connection between life and labor at this point. And it is in line with a remark that Marx also makes in the so-called German ideology, that Hegel has really a point in saying that labor is central for whole idealism. So maybe can I add my question then? So this was more of a remark. So if this is the case, and if you would agree to this, what does it make with the diagnosis that Thomas quoted in the very beginning, that we have to overcome the Promethean worldview? Because if labor plays such an important role in shaping our sensibility and shaping our access to the world and overcoming the myth of the given, don't we have to keep up the Promethean worldview? That's an actual question. Sorry.
So I think you're right, but I see Marx, at least in these early writings, even when he talks about labor and when he talks about sort of an unalienated relationship to the product of one's own labor, he really stresses also sort of an aesthetic relation to one's own labor and to one's own activity. So he has kind of, these are passages that perhaps I didn't stress as much, but he really kind of thinks about kind of an absence of alienation as consisting in a relationship in which one can be independent, independent also of kind of large processes of industry and so on, and also one in which one can be creative, one can have sort of an aesthetic connection to what one produces. And so I think you're right that labor is sort of crucial for kind of connecting these two senses of sensibility. But I think, even there, this role of sort of active sensibility, I think, is a really crucial component of what Marx wants to emphasize in the distinction between alienation and unalienation. I hope that helps. I'm not sure if I understood your real question, but we can talk about it. We can talk about it later.
Okay. Yeah. So I also have a follow-up on this issue. So two questions. So the first one is on the which life might solve the problem. And so I thought that it's quite interesting. At one point you then arrived at the ways in which Marx distinguishes human activity from animal activity, and then everything seems to hang on conscious life activity. And so there's a sense in which we could assume that that in a way, even if life at first might seem like an intermediate position in a certain sense between activity and passivity, it involves both. There, our human activity, our human kind of life is then distinguished by the role that consciousness or self-consciousness plays. And so there's an idealist way of understanding that. So we could say, well, the idealism just creeps back in. And so I was just curious whether you could say something about why it doesn't for Marx. And it seems to me that just following up on that comment, that it seems that the way in which consciousness plays a part in human life is very much practical self-consciousness. So the consciousness that we have of our own activity, so one that involves our passive engagement with the world. So that there is, we also then need to think about this other side. That's related to the second point I wanted to ask you about. So in your whole talk, you were stressing the ways in which our sensibility must already be conceived of as active. So I very much agree with you. So the way in which the myth of the given is countered is by saying, well, understanding is active all the way. And so sensibility remains a dumb passive capacity, but the actual job is being done by the understanding.
But my question is now whether it makes sense then to also consider the flip side. So if it's true that our receptive capacity is already active, wouldn't we need to think about the ways in which our activity, our Promethean activity, is already passive or sensible in a certain sense, so needs a different kind of understanding. And so the question would be whether your aesthetic conception that was restricted to sensibility could be complemented by the ways in which human activity by Marx is also understood in a quasi-aesthetic way. So even if he's talking about labor, he thinks about the way in which in labor we do not just solve a problem or fulfill our needs, but at the same time express ourselves in a certain sense. So there's a way in which activity has also is understood in a different way.
Yeah, so thanks so much. Yeah, I think you're totally right, especially kind of the stress on the sort of practical activity. And so, and I think that kind of goes back to my response to the question right before, that there is this important sense of the aesthetic that is involved in production. And I still want to understand this as part of like my broad conception of sensibility, kind of if we read sensibility in this Kantian way, then I think, even for Kant, sensibility plays a role in practical activity. I mean, he's very dismissive of it, which I don't think that Marx is. But, I think if we sort of broaden the conception of sensibility here, it can also kind of make sense of sort of this aspect of production or practical activity that's not per se moral activity, and which Kant therefore tends to dismiss or not really notice as being possibly a form of free activity. I see Marx as really stressing that no, there is this form of freedom in production. Maybe you could say that Hegel already says this as well. But there's a form of freedom in labor and production that Kant doesn't see. But again, we have to sort of understand this as aesthetic. Maybe this is a point that, well, anyway, I was thinking about whether this could be said of Hegel as well. But there's this aspect of kind of an aesthetic relationship to production that still sort of retains this this first sense of sensibility as well. And so I don't want to necessarily divide these senses. So I see Marx as really wanting to sort of stress a kind of conception of sensibility that's very capacious and active, even in the sense of sort of shaping the world. Yeah, not just perceiving the world, but also shaping the world.
Hello. Okay. Thank you so much for the talk. I think it was great. You work a lot with early Marx, and my question is, how does this relate to the late Marx, especially with regard to your third part, where you say on the handout, both Kant and Marx agree that sensibility supplies its own forms, yet Marx claims that this form is made in experience rather than an a priori operation of cognition prior to experience. And I think with regard to capital, we could say that the objects of sensibility are produced by concrete labor, but in the context of commodity exchanging society, this is at the same time necessarily abstract labor, and that the commodity is not only a sensible, so the result of it is not only a sensible object, but a sinnlich-übersinnliches thing. So I would just be interested in your thoughts on the relation of commodity fetishism and sensibility, and if there's not a certain aspect or an important aspect of sensible objects in capitalist productions that are not empirical in such a sense.
Yeah, that's a great point. So you're right that I'm really focused on early Marx in this paper, and I think that's in part because that's kind of when Marx's focus is more on some of these questions that he then sort of overcomes in some way later on. But there are some very kind of intriguing passages in Capital that I think still sort of point in the direction that I'm emphasizing in this paper, where kind of Marx is still emphasizing, in kind of these very isolated passages where he talks about the prospect of, of kind of, he stresses a more sort of aesthetic relation to the object as kind of what overcoming capitalism might sort of allow us to do. So I'd be happy to talk about that more, but it's very much kind of in the margins. And in terms of what you're saying about commodity fetishism, yeah, I really like this idea that you're stressing of kind of commodity fetishism as something that we can't actually make sense of in sort of solely empiricist terms. And so there is this role there, I think, also for the way in which we think about the object that is key in his analysis of it, and where sort of the conditions of thought and practice are sort of kind of bound up with one another in such a way that it's kind of hard to even sort of get out of it in some sense. So I haven't really thought too much about sort of how to extend the reading that I've given here to some of these other issues, but I think in terms of what you're saying about sort of abstract labor as figuring into the commodity, I mean, I see that as really kind of taking up a point that I see him making as well in the early writings, where he talks about, for instance, the mineral as basically just perceptible as a kind of commodity or just as a kind of abstraction. So I see these elements as still figuring into the later analysis, but perhaps not always as explicit or maybe more complicated in some ways, but really happy to talk about it further.
Okay, we have 4 minutes left and there are 2 people left on the list. You're the next.
Thank you. So thank you for your talk. And my question has to do with the initial framing. So you say Marx is often understood partly due to the interventions of Engels as arguing against mechanical materialism, but we should understand him instead as targeting contemplative materialism. And I found that really interesting because I tend to think that they're the same thing. And that part of Marx's critique that he's raising is that precisely if you approach the world from a contemplative posture, as much philosophy and science does, then what you will see is a strictly deterministic, mechanistic world without that is not infused, as it were, right, with agency and concepts and ideas and so on, right? I appreciated your contextualizing him with Kant because I think he is answering, I think he does actually see himself even as answering a question that Kant poses, what makes science possible, if it is possible? And we have Marx, I tend to read Marx as answering, well, what makes it possible is our sensuous, practical interaction with the world. And what is significant is that when we approach the world from that way, it's harder for us to get things wrong, right? And see it in this like mechanistic manner. And I'm thinking about things like in what was published as a German ideology, Marx's comments that Feuerbach is so interested in pure natural science, but there's no pure nature to do science about, right? There's just the world that is completely already transformed by our activity, and that is what makes it knowable. So I wanted to hear more about why we should think that contemplative materialism is different from what you call mechanistic materialism, and why we would read Marx differently. I just want to hear you expound a bit more on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so I think, I should clarify that I see the distinction as between mechanical materialism and intuitional materialism. But I agree with you that kind of, this aspect of the critique of mechanical materialism that comes out later is also really important. But I think that we can kind of understand it better in some way. We can sort of add on more nuance if we understand also the role of sensibility and intuition and how that's playing into the critique. And I really liked what you said about kind of the critique of sort of pure natural science and how there's no pure natural science. There's always a way, science is always mediated also by thought and by practice. And I was thinking about this also with what he says about sort of the what they say about the cherry tree and how often the examples that will be given of like sort of a pure empirical datum will be like an organism or a plant, how they always sort of come back to this issue of kind of life as being shaped in some way as well by practice. So in terms of what changes exactly, well, I think just it allows us to see more what Marx, the way Marx is engaging with kind of the history of philosophy and thinking, especially in terms of thinking about consciousness and the mind. And there's been a whole tradition that wants to say that Marx like never engaged with that at all, never cared. And I don't think that's right. And that's not to say that he doesn't have his critiques of that tradition that are very important, but I think it kind of adds on another layer of understanding what he's doing, to see him as also engaging with aspects of this tradition. So, but I'd be happy to talk more. Yeah. And I think that's missed when you just focus on the critique of mechanical materialism.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to subject ourselves to the abstract domination of time. So I'm very sorry for cutting the last question. That was really great. Thank you so much for your talk. Thank you so much for your question. Thank you for thinking with us. And we start at 12.